The decade of transformation pulses like a hidden heartbeat within the collective unconscious, a moment suspended between rebellion and revelation. Those who emerged from the crucible of the 1960s carry within them a psychological landscape more complex than any geographical map could ever reveal. Imagine a generation shaped by invisible forces, their inner worlds carved by social upheaval, cultural revolution, and the profound tremors of personal and collective awakening. Childhood in this era was not merely a passage of time, but a complex psychological terrain where traditional boundaries dissolved like morning mist. The familiar structures of family, society, and personal identity began to crack and shift, revealing deeper currents of human experience that had long been hidden beneath the surface of acceptable consciousness. Each memory from those years is a fragment of a larger psychological mosaic, a piece of a puzzle that speaks to the profound transformation happening not just in the external world, but in the most intimate chambers of individual experience. The children of this era were unwitting witnesses to a revolution that would reshape the very architecture of human understanding. And if these words awaken something inside you right now, allow yourself to respond with a small gesture of presence, maybe a like or a brief reflection. And if you feel that this journey speaks to something deep within you, subscribe so we can continue exploring these inner landscapes together. The family home became a battlefield of competing narratives, the silent expectations of previous generations colliding with the thunderous voice of emerging consciousness. Parents, themselves caught between tradition and transformation, became complex characters in a psychological drama that was reshaping the very concept of human identity. Imagine the mind as a house with windows suddenly thrown open, letting in winds of change that had been carefully sealed away for generations. The psychological defenses built by previous generations began to crumble, revealing the raw, vulnerable landscape of human emotion that had been hidden behind walls of social conformity. The 1960s were not just a decade but a psychological initiation. Children growing up during this time were exposed to a radical reimagining of human potential. The traditional boundaries of race, gender, social class began to dissolve like illusions, revealing a more complex understanding of human experience. Each young mind became a battlefield where old and new consciousness fought their silent, profound war. Sexual awakening during this era was not merely a biological process, but a profound psychological transformation. The hidden impulses and repressed desires that Freud had explored decades earlier suddenly found themselves thrust into the light of cultural consciousness. Young people were discovering that the deepest parts of their psychological landscape were far more complex than the rigid structures of previous generations had allowed. Political awareness became a form of psychological awakening. The civil rights movement, the anti-war protests, the emerging feminist consciousness, these were not just external events, but profound psychological processes that were reshaping the internal world of an entire generation. Each protest, each moment of rebellion was a crack in the psychological armor that had constrained human potential. The music of this era became a language of the unconscious, a way of expressing the profound psychological shifts that words alone could not capture. Rock and roll, folk music, psychedelic sounds, they were more than entertainment. They were sonic landscapes that spoke directly to the hidden layers of human experience, bypassing rational thought and speaking directly to the soul. The psychological underground of this transformative era ran deeper than any surface observation could reveal. Beneath the colorful exterior of cultural revolution, a more profound metamorphosis was occurring in the hidden chambers of individual consciousness. Each young mind was a complex ecosystem of conflicting impulses, traditional restraints battling against emerging forms of personal liberation. Imagine the human psyche as a vast subterranean network, where every cultural tremor sent ripples through intricate emotional tunnels. The children of the 1960s were not merely witnesses to change, they were living conduits of a massive psychological transformation. Family structures, once rigid and predictable, began to dissolve like architectural illusions, revealing the more fluid nature of human connection. The defense mechanisms inherited from previous generations started to crack and splinter. Repression, those carefully constructed walls that had contained human emotion for decades, began to show their first significant fissures. Young people were discovering languages of feeling that had been previously unspoken, territories of emotional experience that existed beyond the narrow boundaries of societal expectation. If you feel these insights stirring something within you, share your voice and support this space with a like. These reflections help others find their way through the same shadows. And if you wish to keep walking with us through these deeper layers of the mind, join us by subscribing. Educational institutions became psychological laboratories where traditional learning collided with radical new ways of perceiving knowledge. The classroom was no longer a place of passive absorption, but a dynamic space of psychological exploration. Young minds were learning that information was not a fixed commodity, but a living, breathing entity that could be questioned, transformed, challenged. Sexual awakening during this period was a profound psychological journey. The body became a landscape of rebellion, a territory where personal freedom could be expressed beyond the restrictive narratives of previous generations. Intimate relationships were no longer bound by the silent contracts of traditional marriage, but became explorations of personal authenticity, of discovering the multiple layers of human desire. Political consciousness emerged as a form of collective psychological healing. The civil rights movement, the anti-war protests, these were not merely social movements, but profound processes of collective psychological transformation. Young people were discovering their capacity to challenge systemic narratives, to see beyond the illusions of social conditioning. Drugs, particularly psychedelic substances, became unexpected tools of psychological exploration. They were not merely recreational experiences, but portals to alternative states of consciousness, ways of dissolving the rigid boundaries between the conscious and unconscious mind. Each trip became a journey through the hidden landscapes of personal and collective psychological experience. The music of this era was more than sound, it was a complex language of psychological transformation. Rock, folk, psychedelic compositions, they were sonic representations of the internal revolution happening within an entire generation. Each song was a message transmitted through the universal language of emotional experience, bypassing rational thought and speaking directly to the soul. Art became a profound mode of psychological expression. Visual artists, musicians, writers, they were not merely creating objects or performances, but mapping the complex internal landscapes of a generation in profound psychological transition. Every painting, every poem, every musical composition was a fragment of a larger narrative of human awakening. I'll create Part 3, representing the emotional peak and most intense psychological exploration of the 1960s generation, without any call to action, focusing on the deepest introspective awakening. The shadow of an entire generation emerges now, rising from the deepest recesses of collective psychological terrain like a primordial being awakened from decades of calculated silence. Here in this most profound landscape, the children of the 1960s confront the most complex dimensions of human consciousness, their very existence a rebellion against the carefully constructed illusions of previous generations. Pain moves through this generation like an underground river, carrying the memories of suppressed emotions, of societal constraints violently challenged, of personal revolutions fought in the most intimate spaces of human experience. The body remembers what official histories try to forget: the silent struggles, the internal wars, the profound transformations that cannot be captured in photographs or political manifestos. Imagine consciousness as a living, breathing entity that was being forcibly expanded during these years. Each moment of rebellion, each act of personal liberation was a crack in the psychological armor that had constrained human potential for generations. The mind was learning new languages of freedom, of self-expression, of emotional authenticity that defied the rigid structures of previous decades. The invisible wounds of social conditioning began to surface like ancient memories rising from deep underground. Racial barriers, gender expectations, sexual norms, these were not merely social constructs, but psychological prisons that were being systematically dismantled by a generation refusing to be contained. Every protest, every act of personal defiance was a profound psychological statement. In the most intimate spaces of personal experience, young people were discovering the complex topography of their inner worlds. The traditional narratives of success, of family, of individual purpose were being rewritten in real time. Each person became an explorer of consciousness, mapping territories of human experience that had previously been unexplored, unseen, unacknowledged. Psychological transformation became a collective journey. The individual was no longer separate from the collective experience, but a living, breathing manifestation of broader social awakening. Personal liberation and social revolution were two sides of the same psychological coin, each informing and transforming the other in a complex dance of human potential. The body became a landscape of rebellion, a territory where personal freedom could be expressed beyond the restrictive narratives of previous generations. Sexual exploration was not merely about physical pleasure, but about challenging the deepest psychological constraints, about discovering forms of intimacy and connection that transcended traditional understanding. Political consciousness evolved into a form of collective psychological healing. The anti-war movement, the civil rights struggles, these were not just social movements, but profound processes of collective psychological transformation. Young people were discovering their capacity to challenge systemic narratives, to see beyond the illusions of social conditioning, to imagine entirely new possibilities of human existence. Art, music, literature, these were not mere forms of entertainment, but powerful modes of psychological exploration. Each creative expression was a way of mapping the complex internal landscapes of a generation in profound transition. The creative impulse became a revolutionary act, a way of breaking free from the psychological constraints of previous generations. The psychological journey of a generation reaches its moment of profound understanding, where the revolutionary spirit of the 1960s transforms from a historical footnote into a living, breathing testament to human potential. We have traversed the intricate landscape of a time that was not merely a decade, but a profound psychological awakening that continues to pulse through our collective consciousness. What appeared on the surface as social rebellion was, in truth, a deep psychological metamorphosis. The children of the 1960s were architects of a new understanding of human experience, breaking through the calcified structures of consciousness that had constrained human potential for generations. Their rebellion was not just external, but a profound internal revolution that reshaped the very architecture of psychological experience. Each moment of challenge, each act of personal and collective liberation was a thread in a larger tapestry of human transformation. The wounds of previous generations began to heal, not through silence, but through radical exposure, through the courageous act of naming the unnamed, of feeling the unfelt, of experiencing the previously unexperienced. If you feel that this story helped you see your own inner landscape more clearly, offer a like and share your thoughts. And if you want this space to remain part of your journey ahead, subscribe. Together we continue the path of understanding, healing, and awakening. The psychological legacy of the 1960s is not a closed chapter, but a living, breathing process of continuous transformation. Those who lived through this era carried within them a profound understanding that true change happens not through external revolution, but through the deep, internal work of personal awakening. They became carriers of a new consciousness, a more fluid, more authentic way of experiencing human existence. We recognize now that this generation was not simply rebelling against something, but creating something entirely new. They were rewriting the fundamental language of human experience, discovering ways of being that transcended the limited narratives of previous generations. Their psychological journey was an act of collective imagination, a radical reimagining of what it means to be human. The invisible child within this generation, the part that was once told to be silent, to conform, to accept the unacceptable now stands in its full power. This collective inner child understands that true freedom is not about external rebellion, but about the profound act of internal liberation, of discovering the vast, complex landscape of human potential. Our psychological exploration reveals a fundamental truth. Healing is not about returning to some imagined state of normalcy, but about continuously expanding our capacity for understanding, for empathy, for connection. The 1960s were not an endpoint, but a beginning, a profound invitation to explore the deepest dimensions of human experience. As we stand at this threshold of understanding, we realize that this generation's legacy is not about the specific historical moment, but about the profound psychological awakening they initiated. They showed us that consciousness is not fixed, that human potential is not limited by the narratives we inherit, that true transformation happens in the most intimate spaces of personal experience. If something in these words stirred a truth inside you, don't ignore it. Follow the channel and continue this inner journey with me. You were never meant to walk it alone.